welcome to Christian Answers. My name is Jeff Short, and today we're going to be jumping into another part of the N.T. Wright pathetic explanation as to why he thinks Christians don't have anything to say about the coronavirus. I did a video a couple weeks ago on why I strongly disagree with this famous theologian N.T. Wright from England. He basically said the Christian church has nothing to say in respect to the coronavirus. It never was meant to say anything about the coronavirus. So he's basically saying if you're looking for Christianity for answers during this pandemic that's sweeping the world, don't look here. We don't have any answers. The Bible doesn't give any answers. God hasn't given us any answers. So there's nothing to say. There's nothing to see. Move on along. Go on home. It's all over, nothing to congregate about. And I strongly disagree with that. I feel that that is such an irresponsible statement, that he is acting so cowardly, so wimpy-fied in his response. I mean, where are the theologians? Where are the church leaders that have biblical responses to the problems of life? And they're not out there very much, and they're not speaking very much, but a few are. I mentioned before in another video, Joseph Pipa, the president of Greenville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. He wrote a great article about how this does display some of God's judgments upon the world. And it does speak to people today in the modern world. It speaks to the unbelieving world. It speaks to the Christian world. It speaks to everyone in some form or fashion, and we need to listen, like the Bible says. He who has ears, let him hear. Well, what I wanted to do today was expand on some of the discussion that I did of N.T. Wright's pathetic article in Time magazine in respect to the coronavirus. Last time, I talked about some objections to N.T. Wright's article. I wanted to add a few more to the objections, and we'll get into it, and there probably are even more objections that I will come up with in the weeks and months ahead. But right now I wanted to deal with 3 or 4 of the objections that I didn't deal with thoroughly in the first video. And the first objection that I wanted to briefly touch on, although I did touch on this briefly in the first video, is that N.T. Wright accuses Christians who are trying to come up with an explanation, trying to grapple with, trying to understand why in the world that God Almighty would either permit this coronavirus or actually send this coronavirus into the world at this time with all of the ramifications that we see on the news every day. Why would God do that? And he says, asking that question and seeking answers for that question is a manifestation of what he called Christian rationalism. And I pointed out that that is not what rationalism historically, philosophically actually means. Rationalism, in its historical sense, is the belief that man, starting from man, and only taking into account natural forces and natural events and natural reason, can explain everything. So this became popular during what is called the Enlightenment. Started off in Europe and it spread here across to the North American continent. You had a group of philosophers called the Philosophes, and you had people like Voltaire and Condorcet and different French, primarily French at the beginning, then it spread to others, German, Immanuel Kant in Germany, and then it came across to North America, and you have people like Jefferson, for example, one of the founding fathers, was an Enlightenment figure, and he was a rationalist. In other words, you remove all the supernatural, all of the supposed revelation from the Bible. He didn't accept the supernatural miracles of the Bible. And you had other leading figures like, for example, Benjamin Franklin was a rationalist. He was an Enlightenment thinker, and others. So what rationalism means is that you start with man, you start with man's reason, and then you reason out from man based on the natural world and natural forces, and you do not include biblical revelation. That's rationalism. So N.T. Wright says, we shouldn't expect any kind of revelation or any kind of explanation as to the meaning of the coronavirus, because to do so would be to give in to the temptation of Christian rationalism. Well, that is meaningless, because rationalism means that you don't take into account the Bible, you don't take into account what God has done in past history, and you limit it only to the natural reasoning. Well, I don't think any Christian is trying to do that, except, ironically, N.T. Wright himself is actually guilty. If you want to call something Christian rationalism, he's guilty of it. Because what he's doing is essentially the same thing as the Richard Dawkins, the atheists, the Stephen Hawking's did when he was alive, and the four horsemen of the apocalypse of the atheists, the four atheists, famous Christopher Hitchens before he died. What they all do is tell you you can't ask certain questions like, what is the meaning and purpose of the universe? And what is the meaning and purpose of mankind? And they will tell you those are meaningless questions. The only purpose for anything is just the natural outworking of natural forces. And so they limit the questions that you can even ask based on their philosophical materialism. Well, N.T. Wright, whether he knows it or not, he is guilty of such a thing as Christian rationalism, because what he wants to do is eliminate even asking the question. And in effect, he's basically saying there is no answer to this question, because he's limiting his answers to natural forces and powers. And so, in effect, he is actually a Christian rationalist, if you want to even go there and start talking about Christian rationalists. So the charge that Christians who want to understand things, the Bible says that the men of Issachar were understanding the times. We want to try to understand the times. Jesus talks about, don't you understand the signs of the times? We look around what's happening, then we go to the Bible and we try to interpret things in light of the Bible. So the bogus charge of Christian rationalism is a complete fallacy. But there is, and I wanted to touch on a second point, there is the fear that N.T. Wright and theologians and Christian leaders might have, is that people will begin to overblow the contemporary events that are happening in the world and sort of fall into this end times symbolism that we see prevalent in some areas of the church, where you're going to the Bible in the book of Revelation, for example, and then you're looking at Time magazine in the one hand and the Bible in the other hand, and you're saying, okay, this is happening here. This is what book of Revelation chapter 10 says here, and you're literalistically picking and choosing passages and then forcing them to mean something based on what the newspapers and the magazines and the television news is telling us. And we saw a little bit of that with, for example, if you remember, decades ago, there was a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, written by Hal Lindsey. And when I was a young Christian, I remember reading The Late Great Planet Earth. It was very interesting because he was doing just that. He was trying to take contemporary news and then going to the book of Revelation in the Bible and going to other prophetic passages in the Old Testament, prophets, and different places. And he was trying to build a narrative, an interpretation of end times based on a smattering of passages in the Old and New Testament and applying those passages to the contemporary news reports. And so, for example, one of the most glaring examples would be when the book of Revelation talks about these flying things in the air. Then you look at the news reports and you see these helicopters going across the battlefield, and you say, aha, that reference in the book of Revelation to the objects in the air flying, that means helicopters. And then you can go on and on and on, and you can apply all kinds of things. And if N.T. Wright is trying to discourage that kind of hyper literalism, hyper application of events in our world with direct Bible passages, if he's trying to discourage that, okay, I understand that, and I understand where his fears would be, and I think any responsible Christian leader would want to discourage someone from just plucking headlines out of the newspaper and then rushing to the Bible and saying, see, that says this in the book of Revelation, and this world figure is the Antichrist. And we have heard those so many times, that for the longest time, the Antichrist was Mikhail Gorbachev because he had a mark on his forehead, sort of a blood mark on his forehead. And so he was the Antichrist. And then for some people, they were talking about Obama was the Antichrist. And then you have all kinds of world political leaders who are labeled Antichrist, and then they pass from the scene, and then it just seems like the same people, they just redo and redouble their efforts to identify the Antichrist, even though it's a different person this decade than it was last decade. So it's just a big jumbled confusion for a lot of Christians, and that's why we have to be very weary and be cautious of people trying to read into the news reports biblical prophecies and passages. Although we do know that at some point in world history, there will be the fulfillment of the book of Revelation, and there will be the fulfillment of these passages that talk about the second coming of Christ. And so we don't want to be skeptical about the prophecies of Christ's return, and we don't want to be skeptical about the validity and the truthfulness of the book of Revelation prophecies. But on the other hand, we don't want to indulge in these kind of careless and reckless applying the Bible to world events so that every other year or every other decade we're changing and flipping, flopping, and reinterpreting, and that just sows more confusion than anything else. So if N.T. Wright is trying to discourage that, I'm all with him. I'm all with him. But the coronavirus is not that way. The coronavirus is not just a headline in the news among many headlines. This is a worldwide event. This is an event that will go down in history, and people will be talking about this if the Lord tarries for 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, if the world is even around at that point. This is a worldwide pandemic, and it's significant, if not just for the number of deaths that it's causing, but for the commotion that it's causing, the disruption of the entire world's economy and the disruption of the entire world's way of life. You just look at the United States today. Most people right now are not working. They have been told to go home and stay there. I mean, in other words, they've been told to take a major league timeout, to just go home and stay there until they're told that they can come out of their homes, because they want to contain the virus to a manageable amount so that the hospitals are not overrun. Okay, that has never occurred before in the history of the world, where you had the entire world shutting down in that sense. And we still are in the midst of it right now as I'm recording this video, and we still don't know what the results will be. We're hoping that when the economies of the world start up again, that they actually can get going again. The worldwide recession that will no doubt come may be even worse than the virus itself. But this is not just a small headline. So what we're trying to do is not do what those fanatical end time prophecy people do all the time, and they're always picking up headlines and applying verses to them and everything like that. You know the ones I'm talking about. I mentioned Hal Lindsey before, and you might also remember Jack Van Impe, the evangelist on television with his wife Roxella. Well, Roxella would read the news, and then Jack Van Impe would interpret the news by applying Bible verses to it. And there were times when Jack Van Impe is on solid ground biblically for prophecies to come, but then there were many times when he would apply prophecies to the headlines that Roxella just read that had nothing to do with it, and the next year totally fell to the ground. So he would move right on and begin talking about some other things. So that's not what the coronavirus understanding is all about. We're trying to understand what God might be up to in bringing about or permitting this worldwide pandemic to come. And we're trying to discern what message God might be sending the world. Now, he says, N.T. Wright doesn't like that. He doesn't want Christians to ask the question, what might God be saying to us? He thinks that's, let me quote him. He says, no doubt the usual silly suspects will tell us why God is doing this to us. A punishment, a warning, a sign. Okay, so he's making fun of people trying to grapple with and understand this in the context of divine history. I wonder if he understands that grappling with and trying to understand the times is a legitimate Christian exercise. I wonder if he's familiar with history, because Christians, even some of the most brilliant Christian thinkers of all time, have done that very thing. I recall, for example, and surely he understands and knows this, that the great Augustine of the 5th century, who lived during the 400s, grappled with and reflected on and pondered and wrote books. The main book that he wrote was The City of God, which is a couple volumes, at least the one that I read during my college years came in 2 volumes. It's a massive thing. And it was grappling with the whole question of how could God allow the fall of the Roman Empire. And you have to understand the context for that, because just like the United States today is a world leader, and that most of the economies of the world are coupled to the dollar in its value, and that the United States is a world military leader, it's a world economic leader, it's a world scientific leader, technology leader. The world on all of the continents, South America, Asia, Africa, Europe, all over the place, people look to the United States. It's a world empire, not in the sense that it's conquered other nations, but it is a world leader. And that's the way, in a small part, the way the Roman Empire was. Only the Roman Empire actually conquered nations. The United States has done so more so through its economic influence and political influence, but also militarily. We can go into countries in the Middle East and occupy and try to correct injustices and so forth. Hopefully we're doing the right thing. But we're a world-class empire, if you want to put it in those terms. And what would be the effect if the United States fell? I'm talking collapsed. What would happen if Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, were to fall to a foreign power? Well, that's what happened in the Roman Empire. The barbarians came in and basically just sacked Rome, and that was something that had repercussions all over the world, and Christians were scratching their heads because by that time they had grown to such a large population within the Roman Empire. And actually the Roman Empire was was embracing Christianity as the primary religion, thanks to Constantine. And so it was a shock to everyone that Rome could fall. And even the old pagans of the Roman Empire were blaming Christians for the fall of Rome and saying that the old pagan gods were angry and brought about the destruction because of the new God of Jesus Christ coming in and taking over. And so Augustine spent years, I think it was even a decade or so, grappling with that question and theologically using the Bible as its basis and coming up with a reason why this historical development happened and how the fall of Rome is God's will. And he went on to explain this whole understanding of the city of God and city of man, and he did a lot of this kind of thinking. Well, N.T. Wright should know that. And so it's a legitimate undertaking to try to understand the times, to try to understand the signs of the times, if you want to call it that. And so that's all Christians are doing in trying to grapple with this coronavirus. Now, N.T. Wright, his only conclusion with this is he says, don't waste your time trying to understand why. There's no Christian answer for why. That's futile, sounding very much like the naturalist, even the atheist Richard Dawkins and so forth, ironically. But he says the only thing that Christians can do along with other people is lament. We can cry, we can sympathize, we can try to comfort, we can grab someone around the shoulder and give them a hug, although that's not the best thing to do right now during the pandemic. They're telling us to social distance 6 feet, so even a hug is a difficult thing right now. But N.T. Wright's basic message is all we can do is cry and weep. And he points to specific psalms in the Old Testament where it talks about the saints weeping and crying, and because there's no answer. Well, I disagree that that's the only reaction that Christians should have. We certainly should cry with those who are weeping, and it talks about in the New Testament that we should cry with those who are crying and lament with those who are lamenting, rejoice with those who are rejoicing. So yes, we want to show sympathy. But lament in its more specific sense is something that should be done primarily in the cases where we have no earthly or heavenly clue as to what is happening. And I don't believe that's the case with this coronavirus. We do have clues. We do have signs as to what is happening. But in those cases where nothing makes sense and there are no plausible, rational, logical answers for something, yeah, then we lament. Let me give you an example. Back in the early 80s, there was a Christian music artist named Keith Green, and he burst on the scene of Christian music with his musical powers, his songwriting ability, and his captivating and energetic presentations and live concerts. And he was powerful. I mean, he really moved the hearts of millions of young people during his brief life. He died at age 28. He was cranking out music that was not just catchy melodically, but the words were powerful. He was a poet. And he was also a prophet because he had been a part of that hippie scene in the 60s and 70s, and he had been a part of the drug culture and that whole free love 60s sexual revolution, and had seen the darkness of that. And so he had credibility, street cred as they call it, and he brought that talent of his music and his singing ability and his musical ability and his songwriting ability, and they all came together. And he began to put out this music that was prophetic and powerful, and many, many thousands of young people came to Jesus Christ. And so things are going great. He's producing albums, and God is giving him music, and people are really being touched by his ministry. And then he dies in a plane crash, along with a couple of his children and some other people in Texas. And it was all over. His ministry, his life, his marriage. He had 3 children at the time, 1 on the way, 4 children. And it was all over in an instance. And in that situation, you can lament because there's like, God, what are you doing? There was no outstanding rebellion in Keith Green's heart. He was not blaspheming you. He was not living in sin. There's nothing in his ministry or his life or anything that you could make sense of it. At that point, you lament because there's nothing else to do. There's no understanding that you can bring to the situation. It was just pure mystery. Had no clue as to why God took his life and why God interrupted this man's ministry that was so powerful and reaching so many people for Jesus and helping so many people find a deeper faith. No, that's lament. So when you have nothing else to do, then you can weep and cry and say, God, like Job, who had no clue. There was a clue. There was a reason for Job's suffering, but he didn't know it. But only thing you can do is lament. But this coronavirus is not that way. And that's why N.T. Wright is wrong, because it's not like the world is going about and it's godly and it's spiritual and people are reading their Bibles and seriously trying to follow the Lord, and they're praying every day, and they're attending. The churches are full of people every Sunday, and the United States is a godly nation and walking in obedience to God and so on and so forth. No, it's not that. It's the opposite. We're a sinful nation. We're a rebellious nation. We're a prideful nation. We have abandoned God for all practical purposes, and even the people in the churches are caught up in the materialism and the selfishness and the love of money and the idolatry of possessions and idolatry of career. And you just go on and on and on. Even the church is in a bad spot right now as far as sin and worldliness and idolatry. And you look at Europe, and the church is in shambles, and the culture has gone off into immorality and debauchery. And in the United States, back here, we have millions of babies slaughtered in the womb of the mother with abortion, and we have, it's just gay marriage, perversion of marriage. You just go on. And so when something bad happens in that context, it's not real hard to understand that God might be trying to wake people up in the church and say, look, I want your attention. Listen to me. So we could go on with some other reasons why N.T. Wright is wrong, but I just wanted to outline a few of those to help you understand. And we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.